Hey, welcome to Tabletop Skirmish Games. I'm Lee, and in this video I'll show you how I painted my Spire Stalker from the Corvus Cabal to a tabletop ready standard with contrast paints. Here's our Spire Stalker all complete, and in this video I'll go through step by step how I painted her. And this will be a quick video, but if you want something a bit slower and more real time, then you can check out my Shrike Talon video, and that's pretty much 3 times as long as this one, and it goes through all the steps again and all the paints you need, but just a little bit slower with a bit more commentary. And so for the Spire Stalker, I primed her with the Wraithbone undercoat and assembled her with the Citadel plastic glue. The paints we'll use in this video are mostly the Citadel colour contrast paints with a few layer paints too. And the brush I'll use mostly through the video is the Army Painter Wargamer character brush, but I'm also starting to use the Kalinsky No. 2 brush as well. Right, let's get started, and our first paint is Contrast Wildwood. And here we're using this for all the wooden handles of the weapons, and we've got plenty of paint on our brush there, and using the longer brush now, much better for holding more paint, and you're able to load the brush up, but also get a real nice fine point to it to get this detail work nice and neat. And I'm putting plenty of paint on here, not swamping it in paint, but enough to give it a good coat and let it run into the recesses and the cracks, and that's going to give us all the shadow we need. And with this contrast paint, we're just going to use one layer of contrast paints for pretty much all of these contrast paints here. There'll be an exception where one will put 2 coats, but for this Wildwood, 1 coat is all you need. And this is a great paint for giving a really nice coat of like thick dark brown paint that's going to look like wood. It's going to leave the raised areas with a nice little highlight, and it's going to seep into the dark recesses and give us a really cool shadow. And there we go, I'm just going into the details with the tip of the brush there, but still making sure there's plenty of paint to give us a nice shadow. And this colour is going to work really well with the next colour we use, which is the Contrast Snakebite Leather. And this paint we're going to use on all the leather straps and belts and all the parts of the model that's got that leather. And this is a great paint. Again, just 1 coat, and when this dries, it leaves a really nice leather effect with a good shadow and a nice highlight on the raised areas. And I'm keeping the brush loaded with plenty of paint here, and I'm being as neat as I can because I don't want to go over too many of the other areas here with this colour, so I'm trying to keep it within the lines, so to speak, but I will tidy it up later with some white base paint, so if I do go over and go on to some other areas, it's not a problem, but I'm still trying to be as careful as I can and really using that contrast paint, starting and ending my brush strokes where I want most of the paint to sit in the recesses, where I want that darker shadow, and then just putting the paint on and then using my brush to push it and pull it around the miniature, and then let it settle where I want it to finish. And then once I've got it in place, leave it alone, let the contrast paints do the work, and they'll dry really nicely. So although it can sometimes look like there's a lot of paint on, once it dries, that's going to give you some really nice shadow and signify some texture there on this leather. Okay, now we're on to the Black Templar, and this is going to be for the hair, but also for the feathers. And for the smaller feathers, I'm giving this a complete coat of the Black Templar, and just lost focus a bit there, but it's going to come back in a second. And then, but for the bigger feathers, I'm going to do a turquoise and black mix, and so we've got a little bit of difference between the colours there, and it's not just completely black all over. So, but just working that paint in, and this now I'm putting loads of paint on the brush, so I'm really putting a lot on, and as soon as I touch it to those feathers, it almost sucks it into all the crevices, and then we're going to get some really nice dark shadows. But you can see almost immediately as this goes on the hair, it leaves a nice raised area and a nice highlight. Okay, now I'm going to take the same Templar black and Terradon turquoise. I'm going to mix 1 part turquoise to 1 part black, and that's going to give us a nice rich dark turquoise for the feathers. And this is just going to break up all that black, and this is going to go on those larger feathers and the single feathers that poke out here and there. So I'm giving that a nice thick coat, and I'm starting my brush stroke at the bottom of the feather, scraping the paint off onto the model, and then flicking my brush up to the end of the feather, and then that's going to make sure that most paint ends up in the recesses, and where I get to the end of the feather there'll be a little bit less paint there, and that's the area we want highlighted. So these are really fiddly, the Corvus Cabal, so I'm being sure to move the miniature rather than myself, and I've got my arms on the table so I'm nice and steady, and then I move the model so I can get my brush in where I need it to go. And here you can see I'm also putting some of this Pterodon turquoise and black Templar mix over the black feathers that I painted earlier. But I'm not putting this on the hair, only on those smaller black feathers. And so this is going to give the model the black hair, a black turquoise, small feathers, and then a lighter turquoise on the larger feathers. Right, now I'm taking some ceramite white base paint, and this is going to be used just to tidy up all the areas where I've gone over with the contrast paint onto the other sections of the model that need to be different colours. So you can see here that snakebite leather has gone over onto the trouser material, which is going to be like a blue colour. So I'm just tidying that up, and ideally you'd use the same colour paint here as was used for the undercoat, which was the Wraithbone, but I don't have that as a layer paint, so I'm just using white paint. And then I'm also going over some of the more raised areas with that white paint, and that'll just give us a little extra highlight when we put the contrast over it. And so here you can see there again where that was like nice and scruffy, I went over to tidy it up. And this is the key really to these contrast paints for getting a nice finish, is keeping those lines really crisp and tidying them up. Okay, now we're going to take some contrast Space Wolves Grey, and this is going to go over all the trousers and the vest. It's important at this stage that that undercoat and any areas you've touched up are completely dry before you put this contrast paint on. And with this one, it dries really dark in the shadows but quite light on the raised areas, and so I'm putting it on really thick now and really like pushing and pulling the paint where I want it to go. And I'm starting my brush there, you can see in the crevice, and as I wipe the brush up it just takes the paint off the brush, and then that contrast paint is naturally going to want to run into those darker areas and the creases, but I'm just helping it along by giving it a little push and pull with a brush. And now this Space Wolves Grey is one of the contrast paints that we're going to put 2 coats on. So I experimented with some other colours, Basilicanum Grey, Griff Charger Grey, but they just didn't work. They're a bit light, not blue enough, and so I've gone for this one, but it does need 2 coats. So I give it 1 coat, and then I let it dry completely, so it's completely dry before I put the 2nd coat on, and then that's going to give it a bit darker material, but it's going to keep it nice and blue, and kind of that's going to work well with the black and the turquoise, and against these browns it's going to be a really nice colour for us. So here you go, you can see now that's completely dry, and I'm putting the 2nd coat on, and we're still going to get the raised areas are still going to be highlighted even with 2 coats, but we're going to get some nice shadows, and this is going to work really well for that trouser material and for the vest too. And with the contrast paints, it's just trusting them to do their job really, getting them on, get it to where you want it to go, and then just let it dry and let it do its work. Okay, now I'm going back to that ceramite white paint, and I let this dry a bit before I started using this so it didn't bleed in. And I'm just tidying up those lines again so that it's nice and crisp between the blue material and the areas that we're going to paint with our flesh colour later on. And so I'm being really careful now, using that longer brush to get in there. Okay, now we're on to the Guilliman flesh, and again that white paint I used to tidy up is completely dry now, and I'm putting 1 coat of Guilliman flesh over all the areas of the arms, any flesh you can see coming through, the face, the stomach, all those sections. When I get to an area that's going to be further in shadow, I'll just go a little heavier with the paint. So in here I put quite a bit in, but try and push it into the folds and push it into the areas where the flesh meets the material. Like there you can see I wiped the brush, and that almost took a lot of paint off, and the paint went straight in there, so it did the work for us. And the same on the face here. I've got the brush really loaded up with paint now, and I'm pushing it into those eyes, into the mouth, into the nose, and I'm just going to give this 1 coat, and that's all I'm going to do for the face. I'm not going to try and paint any eyes or anything like that. At this level I'm just sticking with the contrast paints and letting them give us the shadow. Okay, now we're on to the Contrast Skeleton Horde. And this is a great paint for bones and skeletons and skulls, and it's going to work really well for this beak and skull that they wear on their head. And this is probably my favourite part of the whole model come the end of it. This really came out nice, and I'm going to do a little wet blend technique on the beak to incorporate some black in there as well. And I'm using the box art as my guide for the Corvus Cabal, so I'm not being very original with the colour scheme, but I'm just sticking to what they have on the box. Okay, so now I'm taking the Black Templar, and while that skeleton horde's still wet, I'm going to apply the Black Templar to the end of the beak. And you can see there's quite a bit of paint gone on there, but I'm just letting it run along, and then I'm going to wipe my brush off with some kitchen roll, and then I'm just pushing that paint and blending it in with that wet skeleton horde paint to get a nice like blend between the two colours. But I want the tip of the beak nice and black, so I got a tiny bit more paint. I just pop that on, and then again just spreading that around in that blend. And then once I've got it as I want it to be, I'm going to leave it alone. The paint's going to still move and bleed into each other a little bit, but there you can see when that's wet like that, just leave it and let it do its thing. Right, now we're on to some base paint, and this is Lead Belcher, and this is going to be our base coat for all the metalwork, the weapons and everything, the armour and the belt buckle. And so I'm putting one nice coat of this Lead Belcher on, and I'm just using it as I do with the contrast paints. I'm just taking this straight out of the pot and just giving it one coat. You could use like a dry palette for this if you wanted to. I tend not to add any water to it, and certainly found that it doesn't work well in a wet palette. But if you want to have a bit more control, then for sure use a dry palette, and then that can help you get a better point to your brush as you pull it through. But for me, I just use it out of the pot and I give it one nice coat and just take my time being as neat as I can, because now I don't want to go over any areas I've already covered in contrast paint, because that's a little bit more tricky to touch up. But we can still touch it up with a little bit of that white paint if we have to, and then go back over it with the contrast. But I just find be really careful, really neat, and give this a nice coat of Lead Belcher, and then that'll take us on to the next stage, which is the Contrast Flesh Tearers Red. And we're going to use this just to paint the little chaos symbol that they wear on their weapons or as a medallion around their neck. And this is going straight over the Lead Belcher, so it's really important that Lead Belcher's dry, and giving it a nice thick coat. And now some technical paint, some Typhus Corrosion, and I got this specifically for the Corvus Cabal. I think it's great. It makes these weapons really manky and dirty and grimy. And if you've read the anthology book that came out for Warcry, the story in there describes how the weapons are really old and that they've been handed down through the generations. So although they're sharp and can do some damage, they're pretty tough, and they've seen some blood and guts in their lifetime. And so this Typhus Corrosion really makes them look like they have. Okay, now I'm going back to the Ceramite White, but this time this is for the little skull and bones that are on the front of this belt buckle. And I'm being as careful as I can to just go over those raised areas of the skull and the little bits of feather that poke out each side, and just trying to give that a coat of white paint. And it's very fiddly, this, very tricky, and I'm just taking my time though, trying to use the side of the brush where I can, moving the model so I can get that paint on there and just going over it. But I did struggle with this, but we're going to cover it up with some other paint in a second, so don't worry too much if you don't get it really neat. Okay, now I'm getting the Stormhost Silver, another layer paint, and this is going to highlight all the metalwork. And so I'm just using the side of the brush there to run it along all the sharp parts and all the edges, and this is going to make that metal come to life. So we've used our Typhus Corrosion just to like muddy it up and make it a bit dirty, but now we're going to kind of bring it back to life with a little highlight, and then move on to the Contrast Agorist Dunes. And this is going to go over that white skull we just painted on the belt buckle. And again, important that white paint is really dry, and then give it a really nice generous coat of Agorist Dunes. And then next we've got another technical paint called Blood for the Blood God. And the Corvus Cabal have all got this blood they put on their neck pretty much before they go into battle, and whether it was a ritual sacrifice before or the blood of their enemies. But we put a little bit on with this Blood for the Blood God, and it's a bit glossy, and so when it dries it's going to look like wet blood, a real nice finish. Okay, and then one of the final stages now, we get some Nazdreg Yellow. I'm just going to go over this piece of like terrain that comes with the miniature here, and this is the same colour I used on the bases, and it's also the same colour I'm going to use on a little diorama I'm going to make for the Corvus Cabal. So I'm just getting one coat of that on, and I'm not going to do anything else to the terrain at this stage, but I will go back to it as I do the diorama. And our final step is to get some grey, and I've gone for a 0.989 Vallejo Sky Grey, and this makeup brush, which is brilliant for dry brushing, which is what we're going to do now. And I'm loading up the brush with lots of paint, and then working it into the bristles as I take off as much paint as I can onto a kitchen paper towel. And you can see I'm really being rough, getting that brush in there and trying to remove as much paint as possible so that we've got a real nice subtle effect from this dry brush. And I'm going to go over all the hair and the feathers, and I'm just trying to use downward strokes here, going really gentle at first, but then covering it all with a nice highlight. And there we go, there's our finished Spire Stalker, tabletop ready with contrast paints, and I was really happy how she turned out. I especially liked the skull and using that little wet blend there to get a really nice effect. And that skeleton horde is such a great paint. I mean, I haven't highlighted that skull at all. That's just one coat of skeleton horde, and it's given us a really nice effect. So for a tabletop ready standard, I'm really happy with this. And if you want to see how I made the bases for the Corvus Cabal, I've made a separate video on that, and that goes through step by step how to make the bases, and that's for a couple of examples there for the different miniatures. And again, if you want to watch a longer video that's slower with a bit more commentary and almost in real time as I paint the Shrike Talon, then you can check that video out too. And the Shrike Talon is my favourite miniature out of all the warbands. It's so cool, it's such a great sculpt, and I really enjoyed painting all of these Corvus Cabal, but I especially enjoyed painting this one. So I could definitely recommend checking out the Shrike Talon if you're looking for a slower paced with more video with more commentary. The paints we use in this video you can use for all the members of the Corvus Cabal, and I'll put links to everything I've used in the description below. There'll be affiliate links, but they don't cost you anything extra. In fact, they can save you up to 20% at Element Games, and for every sale made through an affiliate link, I get a small commission, and that's going to help me develop the channel and create much more content like this. So thanks so much for that support, I really appreciate it. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I always like to get your feedback, it's really cool to hear from you, and I really hope this video's been helpful. Thanks so much for watching. Please like if you like it, subscribe for more videos like this, and don't forget to hit the notification bell to join me next time on Tabletop Skirmish Games.